once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our special guest author is Father Timothy Gallagher, OMV. His book is Beginning in the Life and Spiritual Legacy of Bruno Lanteri, and it's published by Crossroad Publishing. Great to have you here, Father.
Thanks so much,
It's always
Doug.
great to see you in person.
It's great to be back.
You've been on Bookmark a couple of times, and you've done a couple of series for us, or one series that we did 2 sections of, and you're actually shooting another series for us. What's the new series going to be about?
About discerning God's will and the teaching of St. Ignatius of Loyola for a person who is facing a major life choice, for example, or any significant choice in life, wants to do God's will, is not sure how to find it. I think this is the most practical teaching in our Catholic tradition.
Okay, let's talk about this book, Bruno Lanteri. Not a well-known name, certainly, in the United States, but it's interesting in reading about his life and spiritual legacy, which you've written here, which is the first English language version of his life, I guess. There was one in Italian or something about 150 years ago or something. But in reading this, it gives me a better insight into why someone who's an OMV rather than a Jesuit is so tied into the spiritual exercises, because it was really central to his spiritual life, right?
When he was a seminarian, Venerable Lanteri had a Jesuit as his spiritual director, and who was a master of the spiritual exercises. And from this Jesuit, fell in love with him, became convinced that there is nothing in the Catholic Church that has the same power of these exercises in a few days, and they can be made in all kinds of forms, in a parish, in a retreat center, in daily life, to awaken in a person the dispositions and desire for holiness, for sanctity. Now the person has to live that out, but the person is ready to go after the retreat. And then the fact that the Jesuits have this, but they are largely engaged in other work, especially education, which is valuable for the church. So you've got a tool that is uniquely valuable, and it's too little available in the church. And so he founded my community, the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, to be knowledgeable in the spiritual exercises and not to do other things, to make this available.
Because he was thinking about being a Jesuit early on, and even later when the order was kind of suppressed a little bit, he actually was thinking of going back and being a Jesuit, right? When
it looked like the Oblates of the Virgin Mary were not going to get off the ground, after 5 years of waiting and wondering, he began to think that maybe God wanted him to spend the last years of his life as a Jesuit. And in fact, it was all arranged. He actually went to the Jesuit novitiate to begin. They started with an 8-day retreat, and during that 8-day retreat, he received the grace that God did not want him to be a Jesuit, but to found the Oblates of the Virgin Mary.
Did he ever explain what that grace was or how that came to him?
He never said anything about it, other than, in fact, the only reference we have to it is from the Jesuit who had welcomed him into the society. This was another man whose cause of canonization is underway, the servant of God, Johann Rutan, later became general of the Jesuits. And he writes in a letter to his general at the time that things have changed. He made the retreat, and in the retreat he understood that God was calling him to found this community of Oblates. But that's all. He was not one to speak easily about the deep, deep things in his spiritual life.
Now, in the very beginning here, Cardinal George from Chicago says, Father Gallagher has written of the founder of his religious order, which he was, with a personal sense of the particular charism of the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, and with a historian sense of the context of his birth and development, because you put it in context of French Revolution, all those kinds of things are going on. Napoleon is holding the Pope captive, etc. The Jesuits are being suppressed. There's a lot of different things going on. Also, a sense of spiritual purpose often obstructed, I thought this was interesting, by a body weakened with constant ill health. These same events are played out in the tension between the church and state in France. It goes on to say, a man who sought always to remain in the background is brought forward in this book so that all can begin to discover his virtues and appreciate his influence today. Now here's where you get into the begin again concept of the book, which he would say, the fact that it's clear in reading his story, he was a person of not great health. He had to overcome a lot of that. And I thought it was interesting, you started off with Cardinal George, who himself, obviously, I think had polio as a child and has always walked with, and has been battling cancer for many, many years.
Well, the first attempt that the young Bruno Lanteri made when he was 17 to give his life to God was an attempt to join the Carthusians. It only lasted 8 days. It only lasted 8 days because the superior could see that this man, young man did not have the health for the rigors of that life. So that you can say, yes, that right from the start, his health was a decisive factor in where and it took him in places that he initially didn't want to go, but which became amazingly fruitful as he went forward. He had what is referred to as an oppression of the chest.
Right, yeah, I was going to, what exactly is that?
A kind of asthma or something along those lines. It's never detailed further than that, but what it meant in practice was that if he made a physical effort of some kind, he could be prostrate then for days.
Too much exertion, and that would be it for him.
And the other was his eyes. His eyes were weak. A slight exertion at times could cause enough pain so that he'd have to give up any kind of activity for a number of days. So he lived his life and exercised a fruitful 49 years of priesthood, always accompanied by these physical illnesses. Now, I mentioned the servant of God, Father Rutan. We have a letter in which he writes to his general. This was when Father Lanteri was in his mid-60s. He died at 71. So he was already frail, also because of age at this point. And he tells his superior that he had just heard that the Venerable Lanteri had done something for the glory of God, some task or some commission. And he said, given the shortness of the amount of time in which he did it, and the magnitude of what he did, in his conditions of health, it was a miracle. And it was that in quotes, miracle, which was typical of his life throughout the entirety of his life.
Well, you say here in chapter 3, a gathering of friends, often too wont to write, at times unable to read. Bruno would later say that he learned theology more with his ears than his eyes, listening attentively to the lectures and conversing with his fellow students. But I thought it was interesting too, but he read a lot of books, didn't he? Because there's even the whole thing where he requested to be able to read the books that were on the prohibited lists, right?
Yes, he was an endless reader, and he had a encyclopedic knowledge of books. Was one of the skills that he learned, that anybody who had a given need, Bruno Lanteri would know the right book for this person, and he trained many other priests and lay persons in that skill. So books and reading, probably a part of the trouble with his eyes, apart from their initial weakness, derived from the intense use that he made of them in constant study and reading and writing. Do
you see his spirituality being affected and outgrowth? Certainly the Blessed Mother, there's some sense, because his mother died when he was, four, I think, right? So people could see that as why he always saw Our Lady, in a sense. But also his suffering, does that affect the spirituality that's come out of your order from him?
There's a certain seriousness about it. There's a certain constant awareness of eternity. The phrase of his Jesuit spiritual director, who himself had a wounded leg and lived with some physical suffering, Venerable Lanteri would take that phrase and repeat it over and over again: paradise pays for all. Whatever we go through, whatever sufferings, he constantly has his eye on the end, on eternity, and the fruitfulness and the rest that will come. I think his physical suffering never allowed him to remain simply still, stagnant somehow spiritually. He was never able to simply remain in the same place, but there was that constant drive to deeper communion with God and to increased fruitfulness. What's remarkable is that he was described as a man with 100 arms and 100 tongues. He was in everything. In almost any major figure in the church in Europe in his time, there's some link to the Venerable Lanteri. And this was all done with the physical conditions that we've described. Sometimes when I would watch Pope John Paul II in his latter years, I would think of Venerable Lanteri as a man who simply would not give up and was able to live an amazingly fruitful life. As you say, I think, Doug, not only in spite of, but actually because of, in some measure, the physical sufferings he endured.
Well, in the beginning you say, the preface say, the primary source of this book is the archive of the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, thousands of manuscript pages, other direct access to Bruno Lanteri's prayer. So you're really dealing with original sources here. And in that time period, so if he's impacting all of these people, is it through letters and messages? And are those the documents and things that you had access to?
Yes. He was always a man, as Cardinal George pointed out so well, who chose to remain in the background. A part of that was physical. In those conditions of health, you can't be out there speaking to large crowds. Part of it also was a choice. that his work, as he saw it, was not so much to be out there in the front lines himself, as to be the one who equipped priests and religious and laymen and women to be able to go out there and do the work. And an amazing number of them did. I'll just give one statistic on this. In the 19th century, in his little zone of Piedmont, so it's a zone of maybe about the size of New Hampshire, in that century, there were...
And that's in northern Italy on the French border by the Alps,
Yes,
right?
nestled right up against France there to the northwest in Italy, which was its own... Italy didn't exist as a nation yet at that time.
Well, you had the Papal States and stuff.
So this was the Kingdom of Piedmont. That little area produced 60 men and women whose causes of canonization are at various stages throughout that 100 years. Some of them are internationally famous, St. John Bosco, St. Dominic Savio, and others. Many of them more locally known. Some of the historians will say that there never has been ever in the church's history a zone, an area that has produced that many saints in a time period like that. Now, how did that happen? It didn't happen by accident. And when they go back to the roots of it, quietly, they all find among the key influences that created this flowering of sanctity, the quiet work of Venerable Bruno Lanteri. With the deep spiritual formation in the life of prayer and the apostolic life he was able to give these men and women, which bore fruit in ways that were unforeseeable at the time and became a great blessing in the church.
Now, one thing I did was struck me interesting that you made this point, that you wanted to make this point. In this book, I've included only evidence I have judged beyond dispute. When a document or incident is attributed to Bruno with unclear or disputed evidence, I have omitted that evidence in my text. Is there a concern in your order, or just in general, that there are things that have been said about him, or that he did or didn't do that they have concerns may or may not be true, or is it just that you're just being very, specific and rigid?
Well, I'll say specific and rigid only in the sense that I wanted to be sure that everything that is said in this book about Venerable Lanteri is based on solid archival evidence. So that required a lot of work. That's why you have a lot of pages of footnotes.
Footnotes in the back, right?
And
you have the Quran of his life as well.
All of those things. But what we're talking about is, for example, he had a brief encounter with one of the very famous names in the church, let's say around the 1820s, the priest, Father Lamennais, who was a star in the church at the time. Later things took a different turn and didn't go so well. There was a letter that is unsigned to Lamennais, in which the writer predicts that something is not right and that things may not go well. Now, some of the historians attribute that letter to the Venerable Lanteri.
I see. Okay.
I read the letter, and the language doesn't seem to me to be his. The handwriting is not his, and so that would be the kind of thing that I would not include. So it's kind of historian stuff that we're talking about.
Okay. Now, clearly, one of the things that struck me too, you talk about his impact. He seemed to have had impacts on him as well. Obviously, the French Revolution, Napoleon, but also Jansenism. He kind of flirted with Jansenism there for a little bit, and then he talks about, I guess, Alfonso Liguori having a big impact on him.
That was when he was a seminarian, and the University of Turin, where the seminarians who were going to go on to higher degrees in theology where they studied, was heavily infected with Jansenism, which is a very pessimistic view of the human person, and took the shape in the Italy of the Venerable Lanteri's time of a severe rigorism in sacramental practice. So you had priests who would deny absolution for months, for years at times, even for very small things. Now, imagine what that means if you go to confession and you have something that it's maybe even difficult, it takes some courage to get there, and then the priest denies you absolution and asks for long periods of penance and the rest. You can see how people would simply stop approaching the sacraments. So he was moving in that direction, and it was meeting this Jesuit, Father Diesbach, his spiritual director, that gave him a greater clarity on this, made him fall in love with St. Alphonsus Liguori's moral theology, which is based on the mercy of God, and gave him that direction for the rest of his life.
And it's interesting too, because I mean, many times those things we see, and there's some other ones besides Jansenism, ones I had never heard of, Febroniism and Rigorism.
Right.
But just many times these things come out of an overreaction to because things maybe had been too loosey-goosey for a while, and you get this kind of other reaction that makes things incredibly black and white or very rigid. But you also say, because you're talking about, I thought it was interesting about penance or going to confession, you say Bruno would later transmit his love for confessional ministry to his Oblates of the Virgin Mary, who he wrote, dedicate themselves tirelessly to hearing confessions, ready to welcome all at any time, especially those in great need. And that, again, ties in with this whole concept, begin again, right?
Yeah, that brings us to the title of the book,
Right.
Begin Again. And I think of all of his teaching, this is perhaps the warmest, most hope-inspiring teaching, this teaching about beginning again. Now, you've set the context very well. You have a context in which people are very burdened by the presentation of a harsh God, a condemning God, a God who will only grudgingly give forgiveness and the rest. And then you have Venerable Lanteri in confessions. So he would hear confessions. He had regular confessionals in different churches. He would go into hospitals, into prisons, and hear confessions. At home, his home was available. People would come to him. He spent, and that's really where he did a lot of his spiritual direction as well. So we have letters which describe the dynamic. People would come to him, good people, but discouraged. Mm-hmm. Discouraged because they keep making the same mistake. They keep falling into the same weakness. Mm-hmm. They're unable to overcome the same sin. Or people who at some point in their life have made decisions which, when they look back on them, seem to them to have closed the door. Mm-hmm. It's too late now. This can never change in my life, this distance between me and God. So in all of these situations, here you have the Venerable Lanteri, who warmly says, no, there is never any situation you can ever get into in life, never any weakness, any sin, any failure, which you cannot bring to God. Turn to God, mm-hmm. Ask his forgiveness, which God loves, even delights to give, and gives in the instant itself in which with a penitent heart you turn to him seeking this. This is his concept of God as Father. His own father was a wonderful man. Mm-hmm. Father for him, God as Father, was always a warm, welcoming, forgiving, loving, sustaining presence. And he says, and then begin again. Mm-hmm. Nothing can ever stop us from doing that. Now, he wrote in his own notes early on in his spiritual life that if I should fall even 1,000 times mm-hmm. a day, just 1,000 times a day with peace of heart, I'll get up and begin again. And what is important to him in this is that we do this without a sense of burden, without a sense of trouble. He says, don't think of that God is the way we are. You know how we are when someone just keeps doing it after you've told them 100 times, mm-hmm. we lose patience. Right. God is not like that. He loves to forgive, and the door to beginning again. One more thing I'll say about this. Some years ago, in my office where I do spiritual direction, I put up a painting of Venerable Lanteri. And at times I'll be talking to people who share this kind of discouragement, and I'll point to the painting and explain this teaching about beginning again. You can always do that. Mm-hmm. You see a light go on in people's eyes. This is one of the key reasons why people flock to his confessional and to him for spiritual mm-hmm. direction, and why he had such an impact. Well,
it's interesting too, because in the preface, what's so nice about this for people to realize as well, is the idea, here you are, you've have several books you've written, you've done a couple of very popular series for us, you got a new one coming out. Honestly, people find your approach and your presentation to be insightful and also powerful and touching them. But it's interesting because you yourself say about one story on Sunday morning where you say, as I sat, however, I sensed a heaviness in my heart because of the fact that something had happened there where you yourself felt you let somebody down, right? And it's really Venerable Bruno's approach that got you back on the right path, right?
It's a small thing, but it symbolized a lot for me. A Sunday morning, was about to head out to the parish for Mass and involvement with the people. And this was a quiet time of prayer in our little community chapel up on a 5th floor, kind of a gray, overcast autumn day. And sitting in the chapel, realizing that something was not right, something was weighing on my heart. And as I thought about it there in the silence, it dawned on me that this had started the preceding day. Somebody had asked me to help in a certain way, and I had not been available to this person. And now I realized that from that point on, there'd been a certain burden in my heart, with the sense that there was an opportunity that may never return. So I was about to leave the chapel, knowing that this was not going to stop my involvement with the people, but there'd be a little film of grayness in my heart throughout the day. And then it dawned on me, this is exactly the situation that Venerable Lanteri has in mind when he speaks about beginning again, whether it's in a small thing or a large thing. There is never any reason why we have to live with the burden. Turn to God, ask His forgiveness with peace of heart, knowing that He loves to give it, and begin again, knowing that He can create 1,000 opportunities, which is what His mercy means. And at that point, I think I even realized at that point, this is going to go in the book in some way. I felt my heart lift, and it dawned on me, this is what people experienced when they approached Venerable Lanteri. And that's why that's the title of this book.
Right. Well, it's interesting, right in the beginning, this was the other question I had. It was time for an English language biography of Venerable P.O. Bruno Lanteri, and Father Timothy Gallagher was the natural choice of an author, and that came from Ernest Sherstone, Vicar General of the Oblates, Director of the Lanteri Center for Ignatian Spirituality. Why did they see you as the natural choice? What is it in your background would make you qualified or more qualified to put this together?
Well, from the moment I joined the Oblates, which is a little over 40 years now, something about this man drew me in a special way, and I would read anything I could find on him. Had to learn various languages because he wrote in several languages. Did that, focused my graduate studies and thesis on Venerable Lanteri, and through the years was the one who would teach our novices about him and the rest. I lived in Italy for 12 years and so had a background in the language and the geography and the places. And then I was writing other books. What actually happened was that as our community has spread into the English-speaking world, in first the United States, then Canada, now Nigeria and the Philippines,
Oh, great. Okay.
more and more English-speaking lay people have wanted to know about Father Lanteri, and there was no tool for access. One young woman, I only learned this afterwards, but one young woman was deeply taken by his spirituality and pressed our provincial repeatedly to have someone write a biography.
Oh, okay.
Well, someone was obviously going to be me.
Okay.
And my provincial did approach me and asked me to do that. That was about 10 years ago, and that's how the book came to be.
Well, have you been working on it in different ways for 10 years, or when did you actually sit down and say, okay, it's got to come together, and how long did that take?
I spent 5 years working intensely in the additional research and the writing that have produced this book, but that comes after, I don't know how to calculate the years, but let's say another 5 to 7 to 10 years of dedication to his writings and life, in earlier years through my studies and teaching.
There's also, prayer was very important to him, right? And there's kind of a prayer program that you wanted to talk about as well that relates to him.
Well, I'll quote a letter of spiritual direction to a married woman, mother of 6 children, busy, obviously. And this is what he says to her. He says, try to get to Mass during the week when you can. Get to Mass and communion as often as you're able. Try every day to spend 15 minutes in meditation, which can be done in all different kinds of ways. You have a book to slowly read, scripture readings for the day, Lectio Divina, but try to find 15 minutes every day to reflect deeply and prayerfully upon scripture and the truths of our faith. Try, he says, if you can, to read at least one page every day from a spiritual book. At least just one page. Now, in today's electronic terms, that could be a podcast, or it could be
on
all
a Kindle or whatever.
It could be anything. Right. And then he said, try every day to make an examination of conscience, if only while your hands are busy, but your mind can be free. Now, I looked at that, and I said, that could be today. Daily Mass, if you can do it, and sometimes it's not going to be possible. 15 minutes somehow, if it's only in the car listening to a podcast or
EWTN radio.
EWTN radio. An examination of conscience, so that at some point we're reviewing where things are spiritually day by day. That's a pretty good prayerful program for anyone.
Okay, let me just ask you, as you're working on your new series for us, is that coming out of a book that already exists? Will that be turned into a book? Do you have another book you're thinking of working on or working on now?
No, that's based on a book that's already written,
Okay.
entitled Discerning the Will of God, a Christian, what is it, an Ignatian Guide for Christian
Right, okay.
Decision Making.
Right, which is also available through EWTN's religious catalog. It's always great to see, especially in person. Keep up the wonderful work. You're impacting a lot of people. Speaking here with Father Timothy Gallagher, OMV, about Begin Again, the life and spiritual legacy of Bruno Lanteri. Check it out and check us out next time. It's available through the EWTN religious catalog published by Crossroad. I'm Doug Keck. See you next time.